Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Ravenswood, West Virginia. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1889, a damp and uncertain spring in Jackson County. The hills were swollen with mist, and the Monongahela's tributaries ran thick with silt after weeks of rain. It was during this season that the first reports of Ravenswood Asylum surfaced in local newspapers. Quiet notes in the Jackson Standard, little more than a paragraph each. They mentioned the state's plan to expand psychiatric care beyond the crowded halls of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in Weston, nearly 60 miles east. The new facility, it was said, would bring relief to the afflicted and provide employment to the able. But by the time the first patients arrived in early 1891, relief was far from anyone's mind. The grounds had been built on the remains of an abandoned brickworks. Workers who quarried the red clay spoke of foundations already half sunk before the first wall rose. The site foreman, Elias Crowder, filed a complaint about unfit ground, but the county commissioners dismissed it as superstition. When the asylum opened, its superintendent was Dr. Horace Lemuel Finch, a man of some repute, having trained briefly under physicians at the Weston institution. Finch believed strongly in isolation therapy, patients removed entirely from society and even, at times, from one another. His journals, preserved in fragments within the state archives, speak of a silence conducive to cure. By autumn of that first year, the asylum held nearly 60 patients, many transferred from Weston for behavioral disturbances. Records indicate that the wards were cold, the corridors uskos, interlit, and the ventilation poor. Yet official reports described it as a model of progress. Local residents told a different story. A dairyman named Thomas Reeves recalled delivering milk each dawn to the kitchen door. "You could hear nothing," he later told a reporter in 1904, "not even a cough. It was the quietest building I ever stood near. Too quiet." In November, a nurse, Miss Clara Vines, filed the first internal complaint. She wrote of patients disappearing from records, not discharged, but simply omitted from rosters. Finch replied curtly that the missing entries were clerical errors, but within weeks, Vines herself left employment without notice. Her final wage slip remains unsigned. When state inspectors visited in February 1892, Finch guided them through freshly whitewashed corridors, the scent of lime heavy in the air. The patients they saw appeared sedated, docile. The inspector's report praised the calm and order maintained by Dr. Finch's excellent supervision. Yet beneath that calm, something was wrong. The asylum's coal delivery records showed far less fuel consumed than expected for a building its size through winter. The fireplaces in unused wards were cold, and one porter, Samuel Red Lowry, later testified that certain wings were kept closed off, except at night, when Finch himself would carry a lantern through them. By March, whispers reached the nearby town that not all who entered Ravenswood were truly patients, and that some had arrived in the dark of night without official papers. The spring of 1892 brought no renewal to Ravenswood, only deeper uncertainty. The asylum's name began to drift through tavern conversations and courthouse corridors like a chill draft no one wished to acknowledge. Even neighboring farms began refusing to sell produce to the institution, claiming unpaid debts or delays in collection. Yet the real reason, according to letters found decades later in a family attic, was fear. One such letter, penned by Mrs. Agnes Cotter, wife of a local surveyor, mentioned that her husband had been summoned to remeasure the asylum's rear boundary. He returned pale and sickly, she wrote, saying the measurements were not right. Each time he paced the ground, it seemed to lengthen by a yard or two. Her account was dismissed as rural fancy, but her husband's resignation from county work followed shortly after. Inside the asylum, Finch's doctrine of isolation grew more severe. The female ward, originally designed for 12 patients, was divided into a lattice of small cubicles separated by wooden partitions, too thin to insulate sound, yet too thick to permit light. The attendants called it the hive. Patients were kept alone for days, sometimes weeks, attended only by silent orderlies, trained never to speak in the halls. The rationale, according to Finch's surviving lecture notes, was to reduce nervous contagion, the idea that insanity could spread through overheard speech. A visiting clergyman, Reverend Josiah Palmer, recorded in his diary that he had been denied entry beyond the main corridor during his pastoral visit. Finch claimed the inmates were unfit for spiritual exposure. Palmer wrote that as he was leaving, he saw a man's hand through a small barred window, tapping 3 times against the sill before vanishing. The Jackson Standard published a small notice that summer about an unfortunate accident at Ravenswood. A worker, crushed beneath a service cart near the coal storage. The man's name was not printed, but later records show it was the porter, Samuel Lowry, the same man who had once spoken of Finch's nightly rounds. His death was ruled occupational mishap. No autopsy was recorded. The nearby Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, the institution Finch once studied under, had by then drawn national attention for overcrowding and questionable treatment methods. Its scandals cast long shadows over smaller facilities like Ravenswood. When questioned by a state committee that August, Finch insisted his asylum was a model of restful innovation, and that all deaths thus far were of natural decline. Still, the local undertaker in Ripley recalled receiving sealed coffins from Ravenswood with instructions not to open them. The lids were nailed fast, more than any regulation required, he told an interviewer in 1910, his voice reportedly trembling. By late autumn, 3 attendants resigned on consecutive days. Their personnel files, preserved only in fragments, list no reasons, only a scrawled note from Finch. Unsuited to quiet work. The asylum continued operating, though fewer deliveries came each week, and fewer families received letters from within. One icy morning in December, a new clerk named Edwin Crane arrived to audit the asylum's books. He was 27, meticulous, recently transferred from the county office. His journals, later found among Finch's confiscated papers, began with optimism. At last, a chance to bring order to the chaos of their accounts. But within 10 days, his tone changed drastically. The final entry before it stops abruptly reads, "Found discrepancies in the food tallies. Patients unaccounted for. Finch forbids questions. Something buried near the old kiln. Will inspect after dusk." Crane was never seen again. By the first thaw of 1893, Ravenswood Asylum stood half-shrouded in fog and rumor. The snowmelt ran brown around its foundations, and nearby residents said the water carried an odor like burnt cloth. No official investigation followed Edwin Crane's disappearance. The sheriff's office declared him absent without leave, citing the lack of evidence of foul play. Yet a quiet unease settled across Jackson County. County correspondence from that year shows subtle changes in tone. Inspectors delayed their visits, supply contractors requested prepayment, and the asylum's correspondence began arriving with different handwriting, though always signed H.L. Finch. Whether Finch wrote them himself is uncertain. His signature remained identical, but the phrasing grew stilted, mechanical, and occasionally misspelled. It was during this time that the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum appeared again in local papers, its overcrowded wards blamed for moral decay among patients and staff alike. Though Ravenswood was smaller and more isolated, its name began to surface in those same articles, never as a direct accusation, but as a cautionary echo. One editor wrote, "When the mind is confined too tightly, it grows silent, but never still." Among the few who dared approach Ravenswood that spring was Constable Henry Dade, a man more curious than cautious. He later testified, in a brief deposition preserved in county archives, that he visited the grounds on March 17th after hearing complaint of livestock missing from the farms bordering the property. Dade found the main gate unguarded, the iron chains rusted through, and the yard littered with broken implements, spades, pails, and one patient's iron shackle. When he knocked at the front door, Finch answered in a stained overcoat, his spectacles fogged. He claimed the asylum had temporarily suspended intake due to a health precaution. Dade described the interior as immaculate, almost newly scrubbed, with lime wash so fresh it irritated the eyes. He noted no signs of disorder, yet the silence, he said, was oppressive. "Even the walls seemed to listen," he wrote in the margin of his statement. That same week, the asylum's accounts stopped showing wage payments to attendants. Their names were replaced by numeric designations. Whether the attendants left or were dismissed remains unknown. In April, another notice appeared in the Jackson Standard, this time from a grieving mother in Parkersburg. Her son, a former railroad worker, had been sent to Ravenswood for melancholic fits 6 months earlier. She wrote that her letters were returned unopened, and that when she came in person, Dr. Finch refused to confirm whether her son was still a patient. "Records misplaced," he told her. The paper printed her plea, but received no reply. By midsummer, rumors swelled that a section of the old brick kiln behind the asylum had collapsed. Children playing along the river claimed to see pieces of bone in the runoff. The sheriff ordered a cursory examination, but found nothing conclusive, only remnants of animal remains, charred and brittle. Still, whispers grew louder. In August, a traveling medical examiner, Dr. Lionel Weaver, passed through the county and requested permission to tour Ravenswood as part of his state survey. Finch obliged, though reluctantly. Weaver's later report, filed quietly with the state medical board, mentions the asylum's unnatural cleanliness and inexplicable vacancy. Of the 60 patients recorded 2 years prior, he counted only 19. When he questioned Finch, the superintendent produced meticulous ledgers showing discharges, transfers, and deaths, all documented, none verifiable. The names of the attending witnesses were identical across pages, signed in the same careful hand. Weaver noted it, but chose not to press further. As he left, he overheard faint weeping from the direction of the closed west wing. Finch insisted it was the plumbing settling after repairs. Weaver's carriage left before sunset, and he never returned to the region. By winter, the asylum's windows glowed only on certain nights. Locals said it seemed alive, even when the valley lay dark. By early 1894, Ravenswood Asylum existed more as a rumor than an institution. Few deliveries reached it, and those who went seldom returned twice. The county ledger still recorded the asylum as active, but its correspondence had slowed to a single letter every few months, each short, polite, and empty of detail. The writer always signed H.L. Finch, superintendent, though several clerks noticed that the ink changed from black to pale brown, as if written with whatever could be found at hand. The nearby town had grown wary of speaking its name aloud. Locals used euphemisms instead: the Red Hill, the Quiet House, the Finch Place. The more religious among them avoided the road entirely after dusk, claiming the smell of carbolic acid drifted from the woods when the wind turned east. In March, a traveling photographer named Mr. Conrad Lyle petitioned the county to document public institutions for an illustrated gazette. When he reached Ravenswood, he wrote that the main gate was unlatched and no one answered his calls. The path was overgrown, the hedges left wild. He wandered the grounds and took 4 photographs. Only one survived, now kept in a private collection in Charleston. A view of the front steps with a single chair overturned beside the door. The exposure shows faint shadows in the entryway that some later insisted were figures. But Lyle himself, in his travel notes, said only this: "It was as though the building were holding its breath." That same month, heavy rains flooded the valley. The rising river unearthed debris from the old brick kiln behind the asylum: timbers, rusted hinges, fragments of slate tablets, and 2 small name tags marked with stamped letters, EC and CV. The initials matched Edwin Crane and Clara Vines. The county coroner ordered the artifacts collected, but before an inquest could begin, a fire consumed the temporary storehouse, where they were kept. Rumors spread quickly. Some said Finch had fled. Others believed he still lived inside, maintaining the asylum alone. Yet payroll records for 1894 still listed 3 attendants: number 7, number 8, number 9, receiving meager monthly wages. No birth names were attached. In late summer, Reverend Palmer, the same who had once been denied entry, returned to perform what he called a visitation of conscience. He found the doors open, the hallways silent, and the rooms empty but for stripped bedding. His brief report to the presbytery noted a smell of medicine and damp paper. He found one ledger on the superintendent's desk. Its final page bore only a single line in Finch's hand: "Order restored. All disturbances corrected." When Palmer left, he closed the door behind him but did not lock it. He told friends he had no reason to. "The place felt sealed from within," he said. By year's end, the state quietly removed Ravenswood from its register of active facilities. No formal closure ceremony was recorded, no inventory taken. The county reassigned its funding to the larger asylum in Weston, the Trans-Allegheny once again absorbing what smaller ones could not. Decades later, local children would explore the ruins and bring home scraps of ledger paper, brittle as leaves. Most crumbled to dust before adults could read them. And yet, among the few surviving fragments, one bears an annotation in unfamiliar ink: "If silence is a cure, then we are all well." The records following the closure of Ravenswood Asylum become scarce, scattered among courthouse boxes and private family trunks. Yet a few fragments survived long enough to sketch the asylum's slow decay. In 1895, a survey map noted the property as abandoned medical facility, though the accompanying notes mention unaccounted lights seen on upper floors. The notation was crossed out in red ink soon after. For nearly a decade, the building remained untouched. Ivy crept across its facade, the windows darkened with soot, and the brick paths sank into the soil. But in 1903, the state briefly considered reopening Ravenswood as a quarantine station during a wave of fever that swept through the Ohio Valley. A physician named Dr. Nathaniel Greer, assigned to assess the site, left behind a detailed memorandum. Greer described the grounds as eerily well preserved, instruments still arranged on tables, ledgers stacked neatly, beds made with sheets yellowed but intact. It was as if the staff had stepped out for air, he wrote. Yet there was something else he noted, subtle but disturbing. Every mirror in the building, from washroom to hallway, had been covered with gauze, now brittle and gray. Greer's report compared Ravenswood's condition to the long-abandoned wards at the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, where overcrowding and neglect had once left rooms uninhabitable. Here, however, he wrote, there is no decay of that sort, only an absence too deliberate to be accidental. He gathered several files left in the superintendent's office, patient names, admission dates, brief notes, and delivered them to the county seat. Within a month, those files vanished. The clerk responsible, Miriam Ellis, resigned immediately after, citing recurrent dreams. That summer, a group of laborers hired to clear the asylum's outer grounds uncovered a shallow trench near the southern fence. Inside were 6 rusted bed frames, stacked and half buried. Beneath them lay what appeared to be bundled linens tied with rope. The men refused to open them. The foreman, Harold Bixby, sealed the trench again and filed a terse statement. Objects disposed of respectfully. 3 days later, Bixby fell from a scaffold at his home and died of a broken neck. The county did not connect the incidents, but the remaining crew refused to return. The project was abandoned indefinitely. From that point on, the asylum seemed to repel interest. The few who approached found their tools missing or wagons overturned on the road. One merchant swore his horses refused to pass the front gate, even when whipped. By 1907, the state marked the land as unfit for development. Trees reclaimed the courtyard. The iron gate rusted shut again. A final mention appears in a 1911 editorial about neglected properties. Ravenswood remains untouched, its windows unbroken, its halls untouched by looters, a building that keeps its own. Locals said that on certain foggy mornings, the smell of carbolic still drifted from the hill, faint but unmistakable, as though the asylum continued its own cleansing long after everyone had gone. In 1912, after 2 decades of silence, the state's Department of Health ordered a final inspection of the old Ravenswood grounds. The purpose was routine, to ensure no vagrants had taken residence. 2 surveyors and a deputy constable, Albert Hensley, made the trip from Ripley by wagon. What they recorded in their field notes would become the last official document concerning the asylum. The men described the approach as unnervingly still. The trees leaned over the road, their branches meeting overhead to form a kind of tunnel. When they reached the outer gate, they found it chained from the inside. They had to climb the fence. Beyond, the yard was choked with weeds, yet the main steps were swept clean. Inside, they reported the floors layered with dust except for a faint trail of footprints leading toward the west wing, the same section that had once been sealed under Dr. Finch's supervision. The air carried the faint odor of antiseptic and paper mold. In the infirmary, glass medicine bottles still stood in orderly rows, some half-filled with crystallized residue. Hensley noted that several corks appeared freshly replaced. The surveyors photographed the interior for record. Only 2 plates developed properly. One shows the corridor, its doors ajar, light falling through broken shutters. The other depicts the superintendent's office, where Finch's nameplate still rested on the desk. A cracked ink bottle sat beside it, dry but upright. In the corner of the room was an examination chair with straps intact. On the back of the photograph, one of the men scribbled, "The room feels occupied." They spent 2 hours documenting the site, then locked it behind them. When they returned to town, Hensley filed a brief statement. No occupants, no threat. He was found dead in his home a week later, reportedly from a heart seizure. His widow told neighbors he had refused to pee at night, and often stared toward the direction of Ravenswood until dawn. After Hensley's death, no further inspections were authorized. The asylum was officially condemned and erased from state ledgers. Over the next years, locals dismantled sections of the outer walls for brick and timber, but none dared enter the central structure. One man who attempted to remove the examination chair claimed that his wagon overturned twice before he abandoned it. Around 1915, a small fire was seen on the hillside. When townsfolk investigated the next morning, they found the asylum's western roof collapsed inward. Rain extinguished the flames before they spread. The origin was never determined. Some speculated it was lightning. Others said it looked like a controlled burn, an attempt to cleanse rather than destroy. By 1917, the last of Ravenswood's documents were boxed and transferred to the county archive. Many were later lost in a flood. Those that remain, mostly invoices, scraps of correspondence, and fragments of Finch's journal, offer no clarity, only repetition, notes about order, silence, and necessary correction. A century later, historians reviewing cases from the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum occasionally stumble upon references to its smaller sister facility in Ravenswood. Each mention is brief, almost reluctant, as though acknowledging it risks reviving something best left undisturbed. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of Ravenswood, a silence maintained even in memory. When the Great War began in 1914, most of West Virginia's attention turned overseas. Yet in small towns like Ravenswood, memories of the asylum lingered quietly, just beneath daily life. Old residents said that during the war's third year, soldiers traveling by train along the Ohio line reported seeing a single light flickering from the ridge at night, where no inhabited structure remained. By 1919, the property had passed into private hands. County deeds list the buyer as Mr. Franklin Dorsey, a retired industrialist from Wheeling. He purchased the land cheaply, intending to convert the asylum into a textile warehouse. His correspondence reveals early optimism. He described the building as sturdy, dry, and already disciplined by time. But within 6 months, he wrote again to his business partner, "The walls weep at night. The floors swell as though the river runs beneath them." Work crews began clearing debris, but halted after a series of accidents. One man, Jonas Terrell, fractured his arm when a door closed suddenly against him. Another fell ill after inhaling what he described as white powder rising from the cracks. Within weeks, the workforce quit entirely. Dorsey made no effort to hire replacements. Newspaper accounts from the Ripley Eagle mention only that the project met with logistical delays. The editor, however, lived near the ridge and later confided to a friend that he could see lights moving through the windows long after the site was supposed to be abandoned again. That winter, Dorsey invited Professor Wilfred Latham, a historian from Charleston College, to catalog what remained of the asylum's papers. Latham's notes, preserved today in the State Library, contain the most detailed surviving description of the interior since Finch's time. He wrote that the floors were still swept, the instruments arranged precisely, and a faint smell of iodine hung in the halls. "Someone," he wrote, "has maintained this place, not recently perhaps, but with great care." Latham found several ledgers labeled Therapeutic Records, 1891 to 1894. Inside, instead of patient data, he discovered identical paragraphs written hundreds of times in Finch's hand. Calm must precede cure. The restless must be stilled. He also discovered a single entry dated April 4, 1894, describing corrective seclusion applied to 3 unregistered subjects. No further explanation followed. After returning to Charleston, Latham wrote one more letter to Dorsey, advising him to demolish the structure entirely. Dorsey never responded. In 1921, the local paper reported that Dorsey had sold the land back to the county for a token sum, citing personal unease. He moved north shortly after and died the next year. His obituary made no mention of Ravenswood. The asylum, meanwhile, stood unchanged, trees closed around it, roots pressing through the old drains, but the central hall remained intact, its walls still bearing faint outlines where mirrors once hung beneath gauze. Those who visited in the 1920s said that if you stood at the gate long enough, you could hear water trickling somewhere deep inside the hill, like the sound of a basin being filled and emptied again. No one ever found its source. By 1924, Ravenswood had passed into local legend. Children dared each other to climb the ridge and touch its rusted gates. Few ever did. Those who returned spoke of the smell, damp plaster and something sharper, like old antiseptic still clinging to the air. Some said they saw pale curtains fluttering inside when there was no wind. Adults dismissed it as imagination, yet even they kept their distance. That same year, Professor Latham published a short paper on forgotten psychiatric facilities of Appalachia. In one passage, he referred obliquely to a secondary institution near the Ohio line, whose records reflect a philosophy of total silence. Scholars assumed he meant Ravenswood, though he never used the name. The comparison to Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum was unmistakable. Both built in the same era, both devoted to the same misguided ideals of restraint and isolation. When a reporter from the Charleston Gazette sought Latham for clarification, he declined to elaborate. Some histories, he said, are best left partial. Still, curiosity returned. That autumn, a young journalist named Eleanor Price traveled from Parkersburg to document the site for a human interest column. Her notes, preserved in a university archive, form one of the last first-hand accounts. She described the road as nearly impassable, washed by years of rain and disuse. The trees crowd close as though guarding something, she wrote. When she reached the clearing, the asylum appeared suddenly, whole, solemn, its windows black but intact. The gate bore no lock now. Rust had eaten it through. Inside, she found a reception hall layered with dust and fallen plaster. The walls bore faint outlines where portraits once hung. In the superintendent's office, she discovered a cracked phonograph, its horn wrapped in cloth. On the desk lay a single page torn from a ledger, the handwriting still legible, des. Pite age. Quiet at last. None remain restless. Eleanor noted that every clock in the building had stopped at different hours. None wound, none broken. The air was heavy and cool, as though the building still drew breath. Her published article, titled The Asylum That Slept, appeared in January 1925. It avoided speculation, offering only observation. But the closing line caught readers' attention. I left before sunset, not from fear, but from the sense that I was intruding on a stillness too complete to disturb. After publication, letters poured into the Gazette from former residents of Jackson County, some thanking her for recalling what others refused to discuss, others warning her never to return. 2 months later, a brief notice appeared in the same paper. Local brush fire consumes structure on Ravenswood Ridge. The article was 4 lines long, no follow-up issued. Officials blamed lightning again, though no storm was recorded that night. When volunteers hiked up the next morning, they found only the front steps and fragments of scorched walls. The interior had burned clean through, leaving an empty shell. Yet one room, the superintendent's office, was untouched. The walls blackened but still standing, the desk and chair reduced to ash, except for a single brass nameplate that read H. L. Finch. It was returned to the county museum, where it remains unpolished, its edges faintly warped, as though once exposed to great heat, but never quite consumed. By 1926, Ravenswood Asylum was gone, yet its shadow persisted. The fire had erased the structure, but not its reputation. People in town spoke of it quietly, at church picnics, in store lines, during long winters, when conversation drifted toward the past. No one claimed to know how the fire began, but most agreed it ended something that had long refused to die properly. County officials fenced the ridge and posted signs warning against trespass, citing the danger of unstable ruins. Still, visitors came. Some were curious students. Others were drifters seeking shelter. A few left behind scribbled notes found later by hunters or surveyors. Heard footsteps, room still warm, smell of ether. These accounts never reached newspapers, but they circulated as rumor until they took on the rhythm of local folklore. In 1931, during a routine survey of flood control lines, a state engineer named Martin Duval recorded the first official post-fire inspection. He wrote that the foundation stones remained blackened yet remarkably intact. Beneath the west wing, he added, there appears a hollow structure or vault, not on any map. Duval's team found a narrow opening sealed with old iron bars, half melted by heat. They did not enter. His report was filed and forgotten among hundreds of others, unreviewed until decades later. Around that same time, a few asylum artifacts began surfacing in local auctions: door plates, ledger fragments, and small glass bottles labeled only by initials. The most curious item was a steel key inscribed Ward C. Its origin was verified by a surviving patient register from the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, which mentioned the transfer of key sets during the early 1890s. It confirmed that Finch's Ravenswood had been intended as a sister facility, sharing both staff and methods. Historians studying those records noted a peculiar pattern. The number of patients sent to Ravenswood exceeded the number ever reported as discharged or deceased. The discrepancy was modest, perhaps 20 or 30 individuals, but their names ceased appearing anywhere after 1894. In 1934, a local teacher, Mrs. Ruth Hollander, led her students on a nature walk near the ridge. She later testified before the town council that the children uncovered fragments of porcelain dishes and a rusted metal tag stamped Patient 47. She turned it over to the authorities, who dismissed it as a relic of the fire. Mrs. Hollander, however, continued researching. Her personal journal, discovered years later, contains an unsettling note. Found a ledger entry in county archives. Transferred from Weston, Jan. 1893. Patient 47. Cause, refusal to eat. No record beyond that line. The finding rekindled brief academic interest. A regional historian from Morgantown requested to study the Ravenswood site, but the request was denied for public safety reasons. The hillside had begun to erode, exposing fragments of brick and twisted pipes, like ribs surfacing from the ground. By the end of the decade, the Great Depression had drawn people's attention elsewhere. The story faded again into whispers, kept alive only by those who lived long enough to remember the flicker of lanterns on the ridge. Still, on certain damp nights, when the fog settled low across the valley, travelers swore they could smell the same faint antiseptic scent, the ghost of carbolic acid lingering, as if the place still tried to cleanse itself from memory. In the quiet years after World War II, the hill where Ravenswood Asylum once stood became a forgotten patch of woodland. The county road was rerouted to avoid its slope, and new houses rose farther down the valley. Children, growing up in the 1940s and 50s, heard the story only through half-remembered warnings. Don't go up the old road after dark. The ground there doesn't rest easy. Yet the land never stayed entirely still. During a dry summer in 1953, a brush-clearing crew discovered the edge of a collapsed foundation. Beneath the soil, they uncovered several iron bedsteads fused together by rust and ash. Inside one frame lay a collection of glass medicine vials still sealed with blackened wax. The labels had long since faded, but the corks held firm, and a faint chemical odor filled the air. The foreman contacted the county health office, which ordered the materials reburied on site. No samples were kept. That same year, Dr. Lionel Weaver Jr., grandson of the medical examiner who had visited Ravenswood in 1893, came across his grandfather's old notes while preparing a lecture on early institutional medicine. He was struck by the precision of the elder Weaver's description, the unnatural cleanliness, the exact count of 19 patients. Curious, he drove to Ravenswood himself. What he found was only a low ridge of earth covered in pine and sumac, but he swore he felt an odd stillness when he stepped within the outline of the old walls. It was like entering a vacuum, he wrote later. Dr. Weaver wrote a short piece for a regional medical journal comparing Ravenswood's practices to those of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. He suggested that Dr. Finch's obsession with isolation may have stemmed from exposure to the more severe regimens used in Weston during the 1880s, restrictions of speech, confinement, and sensory deprivation. Silence, Weaver concluded, was not therapeutic but terminal. It ended not only the patient's illness, but their identity. His article received little attention at the time, yet it revived enough curiosity for local historians to request a new excavation. The proposal was denied. The county cited budget limits and potential contamination. The site remained untouched. In 1958, however, flooding along the river washed away part of the hill's southern edge, exposing the old cellar arch. Teenagers exploring the area claimed to see shelves lined with bottles, glinting faintly before collapsing into the mud. When authorities arrived, the entrance was buried again by a landslide. By the 1960s, what remained of Ravenswood had blended entirely into the landscape. Newcomers to the county sometimes noticed an unnatural clearing amid the trees. No grass, only pale soil that stayed cool even in July. Locals called it the White Patch. One retired nurse, Ellen Crowder, said she visited the clearing once while tracing her family records. Her great-grandfather, Elias, had been the original foreman who'd warned about the unstable ground before the asylum was built. Standing there, she said, she felt as if the place recognized her. She left quickly, taking nothing. But in her diary that night, she wrote a single line that echoed Finch's old reports. Still quiet, still waiting. By 1968, Ravenswood was little more than a name passed around in ghost stories and whispered family lore. The ridge where the asylum once stood had grown thick with trees, the old gateposts barely visible under layers of ivy. Yet that year, a new highway project brought surveyors dangerously close to the site and stirred up old unease. The survey logs from that summer record an anomaly. While testing soil density along the ridge, one of the drill rigs struck what the crew believed was an underground chamber. The borehole collapsed almost immediately, releasing a faint chemical odor described as sharp, medicinal, and metallic. Work stopped for the day. The next morning, the site foreman reported mild burns on his hands despite wearing gloves. Samples were sent to the state lab but never analyzed. The container cracked in transit, and the contents evaporated. When word spread, older residents warned the construction crew to avoid the area. A retired county clerk, Mrs. Beatrice Nolan, told a local reporter that her grandfather once handled correspondence from Ravenswood. They were proud of their silence, she said. Everything there was meant to be closed, even the air. That same summer, Professor Latham's earlier writings were rediscovered by a graduate student researching defunct institutions. The student, Robert Field, traveled to Ravenswood to locate any surviving artifacts. In his notes, he described the clearing as unnaturally level, as if something beneath still shaped the surface. He collected fragments of tile and brick, but found no trace of the foundations. In October, Field returned with a small tape recorder to document ambient sounds for a university project. The recording, still preserved in the archives, captures 30 seconds of wind through trees, then a hollow metallic clink, followed by silence. At the 28-second mark, the recorder clicks off. Field's report simply states, "Device malfunctioned, ground unstable, will not return." Around this time, local papers ran short features on haunted sites of the valley, mentioning Ravenswood in passing. They repeated the old connections to the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, framing Finch's institution as a darker cousin of Weston, smaller, stricter, and far less documented. The article concluded, "If Weston's tragedy was in its noise, Ravenswood's was in its quiet." By the 1970s, the land was designated as protected woodland. Signs marked unsafe terrain discouraged trespassers, though that rarely stopped them. Hikers reported feeling disoriented near the crest, compasses wavering, watches slowing a few minutes before returning to normal. The county dismissed these as coincidences caused by magnetic iron deposits in the soil. One incident, however, stood out. In 1974, a forestry ranger named Alan Dorsey, a descendant of the industrialist who once owned the land, was conducting a fire survey when he discovered a half-buried metal plate near the ridge. It was tarnished but legible. Ravenswood State Hospital, Ward C. He turned it in to the Historical Society, where it remains catalogued but rarely displayed. The curator's only note beneath it reads, "Recovered from an area where nothing should have been." After that, no one from the county offices mentioned Ravenswood again. Officially, the ridge was just another patch of forest, quiet, inaccessible, and best forgotten. By 1982, the forest had reclaimed nearly every trace of Ravenswood Asylum. The ridge was thick with oak and birch, and only those who knew where to look could still find the faint depression where the courtyard once stood. It was around this time that the Jackson County Historical Society launched a brief campaign to document lost institutions of the state. Ravenswood was included reluctantly, its mention buried deep in a footnote. The project's lead researcher, Dr. Harriet Cole, specialized in psychiatric history. She was fascinated by the scattered accounts of Ravenswood and its connection to the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. Cole traveled to Weston first, reviewing admission ledgers from the 1890s. There, in faded ink, she found multiple entries marked "Transferred to Ravenswood. See Finch docket." None of those names reappeared in subsequent pages. "It was as though they were erased mid-sentence," she wrote in her journal. In June 1982, Cole visited the ridge herself. Her assistant later recalled that she insisted on going alone, saying she wanted to hear the place breathe. She returned to town after dusk, pale and silent. That night, she wrote a 4-page report, later found among her papers. "The site is still, not empty, but self-contained, ground unusually firm for recent rain. Found remnants of flooring under leaf layer, old wood, perfectly dry. Brief odor of disinfectant, impossible to trace. Stayed only 1 hour." 2 weeks later, Cole submitted a proposal to fund a full excavation, but the state declined. She moved on to other projects, yet friends noticed she never spoke above a whisper afterward. In the following years, the Historical Society published a slim booklet summarizing their findings. Ravenswood received 3 paragraphs, dates, location, a vague reference to incomplete records. The last line simply read, "Status of original staff Remy, Ains unverified." The ridge remained undisturbed until 1994, when a severe storm uprooted several trees and exposed brick fragments near the old service road. A few local youths exploring the area found a small glass bottle among the debris. Inside was a rolled slip of paper. Faded but legible, it read, "Subject stable. Progress marked by quiet compliance." The handwriting matched that of Dr. Finch from the 1890s archives. The bottle was turned over to the sheriff's office, then forwarded to the State Museum. It was never displayed publicly. In later interviews, one of the boys, now grown, described the moment they found it. "We thought it was just junk until we saw the writing. Then everything went cold, like the air got heavier." That remark became a footnote in a local magazine's Halloween issue titled "The Hill That Forgot Its Name." Most readers dismissed it as invention, but among those who had lived long in Jackson County, it reopened a question many preferred to leave buried. If Ravenswood had been erased, why did its records, artifacts, and handwriting still find their way back? One piece at a time. By the turn of the millennium, the legend of Ravenswood Asylum existed mostly online, half fact, half folklore. Amateur historians and curious thrill-seekers traded stories in early internet forums, each claiming to have uncovered new evidence. Some posted scanned photographs of the ridge, circles drawn around shadows they insisted were remnants of walls. Others uploaded copies of Dr. Finch's old signatures, comparing them to modern handwriting for proof of forgery or fraud. In 2001, a small team of graduate students from Marshall University undertook what they called the Ravenswood Project. Their goal was modest: to map the known location and gather surviving documents from the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum archives. They discovered that more than half of the Ravenswood transfer files were missing, possibly removed decades earlier. The remaining pages were redacted with heavy ink, entire sentences blacked out. Lead researcher David Merrill visited the ridge that summer. In a taped interview recorded afterward, he described the site as eerily symmetrical, almost landscaped. He also noted something peculiar: wildflowers growing in straight lines, as if tracing the asylum's old hallways. Merrill's team collected soil samples and found faint traces of mercury and formalin, common 19th-century disinfectants that should have dissipated long ago. The findings never made it into print. Merrill's laptop and notebooks were stolen from his car 2 weeks later, and the university quietly shelved the project. Yet his colleagues later confirmed one unsettling detail. Among the recovered data was a scanned image of a single document labeled Finch Case 47. It contained only 2 sentences: "All disturbances corrected, order absolute." Local newspapers briefly revived interest. One columnist suggested that Finch had experimented with extreme isolation therapy, perhaps confining patients in underground wards to enforce total quiet. Another writer argued that such rumors were exaggerations born from confusion with the notorious overcrowding at Trans-Allegheny. Still, visitors continued to report strange impressions. A forestry volunteer in 2003 noted that the clearing near the ridge remained unnaturally bare of wildlife. "No insects, no birdsong," he wrote in his field report. "Sound doesn't carry there. It stops." The state declined to reopen the case, calling it an issue of historical curiosity, not public concern. But curiosity has a way of persisting. Independent researchers compiled digital archives, reconstructing Finch's writings and piecing together testimonies from court clerks, undertakers, and relatives of former staff. One of them, an archivist named Mark Tiller, found a margin note in an 1893 ledger from Weston: "Transfer complete. Finch insists silence maintained, not recommended." That small annotation became the basis for an online documentary in 2006, The Quiet House of Ravenswood. It featured historians, local witnesses, and grainy shots of the wooded ridge. The film ended with a shot of the forest at dusk, the camera lingering just long enough for faint light to flicker between the trees. The director claimed it was nothing more than passing cars reflected through fog. But in Jackson County, few believed that explanation. Those who lived near the hill said the light appeared too steady, too contained, like a lantern carried carefully down a hall that no longer existed. In 2009, renewed interest in Ravenswood came unexpectedly from the construction of a new telecommunications tower on county land bordering the ridge. Before work could begin, environmental impact assessors were required to survey the area. Among their team was Dr. Karen Delaney, an archaeologist specializing in 19th-century institutional architecture. Her preliminary report, never formally published but later leaked online, suggested that the hill concealed more than burned foundations. Delaney's notes describe a subterranean vault or service corridor, its entrance half-collapsed but lined with dressed stone, not brick. Carbon analysis of nearby debris dated the masonry to the 1880s, matching the construction period of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. She concluded that Ravenswood may have shared architectural plans with its better-known counterpart. Her team unearthed a few artifacts: a rusted key ring, a ceramic tag numbered 47, and what appeared to be a section of wall bearing faint parallel gouges, as if something had been dragged repeatedly against it. The items were catalogued and sent to the state's preservation office. Within weeks, the vault was resealed for safety. Officially, the tower project moved a mile east, citing poor soil stability. Unofficially, no one wanted to dig further. Shortly afterward, Delaney gave a university lecture recounting her findings. She spoke calmly until someone asked whether she'd felt uneasy during the excavation. She paused, then said, "The silence down there was layered. Not absence of sound, but something pressed against it." That line circulated widely, reigniting interest in Finch's so-called doctrine of quiet cure. Researchers re-examined surviving letters between Finch and his mentors at Trans-Allegheny. One letter, dated 1890, included this cryptic sentence: "You cannot reason the mind back to peace. You must subtract the noise until nothing remains but compliance." In late 2010, the Jackson County Historical Society curated a small exhibit titled Echoes of Ravenswood. It displayed Finch's brass nameplate, several ledger reproductions, and the bottle found during the 1994 storm. Visitors reported an acrid scent near the display case, though staff insisted the items had been sterilized. Attendance was modest, but the guest book filled with short, unsettled comments. Uneasy, cold air, felt watched. The exhibit closed early after humidity damaged several documents. When conservators opened the sealed case, they found the paper inside the bottle had darkened to near black, the writing still visible beneath in faint relief, as if rewritten by time itself. Since then, the ridge has remained fenced off. County records mark it simply as protected historical parcel, no public access. Locals rarely mention it except when newcomers ask directions and point too close to the trees. Then, someone will shake their head and say softly, "That's not land you walk on. It's land that remembers." And on misty nights, truck drivers along Route 33 still report seeing a faint light on the ridge, steady, low, and moving slowly between invisible walls, as if someone were making rounds long after everyone else stopped keeping count. By 2015, the Ravenswood Ridge had become an unmarked site on most county maps, its boundaries blurred under the green of state forest. Yet interest persisted quietly among local historians, particularly those who trace the genealogy of institutional reform in West Virginia. The most thorough of them, Dr. Samuel Knorr, published a small monograph titled Instruments of Silence: The Hidden Architecture of Early Asylums. In one chapter, Knorr compared floor plans of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum with a set of unsigned blueprints found in a private collection in Charleston. The drawings were labeled only Auxiliary Facility, Ravenswood Division. They depicted a compact structure with a main corridor leading to 3 sublevels, 2 marked as therapeutic quarters, the third simply labeled Observation. No records elsewhere mention these basements. When Knorr visited the ridge in 2016, he carried a copy of those blueprints. Using ground-penetrating radar, he detected hollow patterns under the clearing, roughly matching the size of the sublevels. He filed a request for permission to excavate, but the state declined on preservation grounds. In his journal he wrote, "Denied access. Pattern remains. Could silence itself have weight?" That same year, a storm toppled several trees, exposing part of a stone retaining wall. Within the crack of the wall, a local hiker found a fragment of ceramic etched with the number 19. The sheriff's department collected it, noting the discovery, but offering no explanation. The piece joined the small archive of Ravenswood artifacts, items that, despite official disinterest, never seemed to stop surfacing. Meanwhile, the mythos of Ravenswood evolved online. Amateur historians traced Finch's origins to Pennsylvania medical records, finding references to a young assistant named Horace L. Finch, who left abruptly in 1888 after a disciplina hearing. The details of that hearing remain lost, but a note beside his name reads, "Recommended for rural appointment." It suggested that Ravenswood had been less an opportunity than an exile. In 2018, the State Preservation Journal published a brief piece revisiting Finch's philosophy, quoting his own words, "Calm is not the absence of will, it is the removal of sound." The editor commented that such reasoning mirrored the darker experimental approaches later condemned by medical boards across the country. Soon after, hikers reported new restrictions near the ridge. Signs warned of unstable soil and chemical hazards. Yet the forest rangers who posted them admitted privately that no contamination tests had been run. "It's easier to keep people out that way," one ranger told a reporter off record. Every few years, someone proposes turning the ridge into a memorial site. Each proposal is quietly rejected. Funding disappears, committees dissolve, and correspondence trails off with vague phrases like inappropriate location or community sensitivities. The silence around Ravenswood endures, not by negligence but by choice. It's as if the county itself inherited Finch's doctrine, that some things, once made quiet, should never be allowed to speak again. Still, those who live nearby say that after long rains, the air over the ridge carries a faint, sterile tang, carbolic and cold, like the echo of a cleansing that never quite finished. By 2020, the Ravenswood Ridge was nearly invisible under decades of growth. Satellite images showed only dense canopy, but the precise rectangular outline of the old asylum still marked the earth beneath. To most people, it was nothing, a forgotten rise of forest. Yet for those who studied early psychiatric institutions, it remained an unresolved question. What truly happened in that place between 1891 and 1894? And why had so many names vanished from every state record? A young historian named Leah Mercer made it her doctoral focus. She began by re-examining Finch's correspondence with the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, finding in one surviving letter an intriguing postscript. "When the stillness deepens, you'll see the difference between cure and erasure." Mercer traced financial ledgers showing that Ravenswood's funding abruptly ceased 6 months before its supposed closure. The county continued paying small stipends labeled night staff, long after official operations had ended. Each voucher bore Finch's signature, dated, legible, and in the same unwavering hand. When Mercer shared her findings publicly in 2021, local news outlets ran short features about West Virginia's lost asylum. Most retold the same story: a forgotten institution, a missing doctor, a suspicious fire. But Mercer went further, suggesting Ravenswood may never have been destroyed completely, that the fire consumed only the upper structure, leaving lower levels sealed and untouched beneath the soil. Her proposal for a limited ground survey drew immediate public backlash. Residents signed petitions opposing any excavation, citing respect for the dead and safety concerns. The county commission voted unanimously to maintain the site's protected status. Mercer withdrew her proposal, but kept researching privately. In an email to a colleague dated October 2022, she wrote, "The ridge doesn't feel abandoned. It's like the air holds a pause, waiting for someone to speak first." She returned one final time that winter, leaving her rental car parked near the old service road. When she failed to appear at a scheduled conference, police searched the area. They found her equipment bag inside the car, untouched. Her notebook lay open on the passenger seat, a single line written across the page. Silence complete. After weeks of searching, investigators concluded she had likely lost her footing near the ravine during the storm that night. The case was closed as an accident. Her family requested that the search area not be disturbed further. In the years since, her colleagues have debated the meaning of her final note. Some believe it reflected resignation, acceptance that the mystery of Ravenswood would never be solved. Others think she may have found something, proof of the vaults perhaps, and left that line as her final observation. Whatever the truth, no further research permits have been issued since. The ridge remains fenced, its ownership transferred quietly to the Department of Natural Resources. At night, locals say you can still see faint light through the trees, steady, pale, and low, moving slowly from point to point, as if someone were inspecting rooms that no longer stand. Those who have seen it don't linger. They turn their headlights forward and drive faster until the forest disappears behind them, leaving only the empty road and the hush of their own breath. By 2023, the legend of Ravenswood Asylum had once again slipped into silence, only resurfacing in brief waves of online curiosity. A few documentaries recycled the same old photographs and fragments of Finch's notes, while locals mostly shrugged at the attention. Yet within the county, small reminders still surfaced, like the ground itself refused to forget. In April, heavy rainfall caused a minor landslide near the lower road. The erosion exposed several clay tiles and pieces of charred timber embedded deep in the soil. Workers found a metal latch shaped like a serpent, blackened by age. County maintenance logged the discovery as construction debris, but an archivist who examined it later confirmed its design matched hardware used in 19th-century state hospitals. No effort was made to recover additional material. The same month, a new forest ranger, Thomas Heller, was assigned to patrol the restricted area. His weekly reports were brief and practical, until one entry dated May 19th. Unusual luminescence on ridge after 0200 AH. Thought it was campfire. No smoke, no smell. Light persisted for 6 minutes, steady white. Source undetermined. 2 nights later, he filed another note. Heard faint rhythmic tapping, possibly animal movement. Sound ceased when approached. After that, his reports resumed their normal tone. When questioned, he admitted he didn't want to sound like the old folks. Around the same time, a team from West Virginia University digitized the remaining Ravenswood archives. Among them was an unlabeled envelope containing 4 pages of handwriting in fading brown ink. Handwriting analysis confirmed it matched Dr. Horace Lemuel Finch. The final page ended mid-sentence. They do not resist now, and perhaps that is peace enough. The discovery sparked brief academic interest, but most institutions declined to host the documents publicly. The Archive D, Rector later stated, "There's something unsettling about keeping them under lights." Later that year, hikers exploring the state forest north of the ridge reported an odd echo when calling to one another, an acoustic pocket that reflected sound without direction, like shouting into a closed room. The description matched early accounts of the asylum's interior, where visitors often remarked on its listening walls. No one investigated. The county's official stance remained unchanged. The land was unsafe and entry prohibited. But for those who lived nearby, the feeling never fully left. Farmers along the lower road say animals grow restless during misty nights. Porch lamps flicker briefly, though the power remains steady. One older resident, Mrs. Nolan's granddaughter, put it simplest. The hill doesn't like attention. Every few years, someone tries to dig up its story, and then it goes quiet again, like it knows how to protect itself. And so, more than a century after Finch vanished, and the asylum was erased from every official map, the story of Ravenswood endures not in books or plaques, but in absence. Its silence has outlasted its walls, its staff, even its name. Yet sometimes, on cold, windless nights, truckers swear they glimpse a faint line of light crossing the ridge, not bright, not wild, just methodical, as if a caretaker still makes rounds, keeping the quiet exactly as Finch intended. Today, the ridge where Ravenswood Asylum once stood is nothing more than a dense thicket of trees. No road signs bear its name, and the coordinates are deliberately omitted from public maps. Only the faint trace of a gravel path leads toward the heart of what was once the main courtyard, a hollow now covered in moss and vines. Visitors who reach it describe a strange hush that settles the moment the trees close around them. Even in summer it feels cool and still, like the earth is holding its breath. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, long restored as a museum, occasionally hosts lectures about its lesser-known counterparts. Ravenswood is mentioned briefly, usually as a short-lived auxiliary facility. The guides speak carefully, avoiding speculation, and quickly change topics. Yet every so often, a question arises about Dr. Finch, where he went, and why no trace of his body was ever found. There is never an answer. Only a pause. Researchers who study the period agree on one fact: the numbers never balanced. Dozens of names appeared in transfer rosters from Weston, but vanished thereafter, with no record of death or discharge. Finch's surviving letters spoke of quiet reform and total tranquility, but offered no evidence of actual treatment. For decades, his defenders argued he was simply overwhelmed by the burden of managing a remote facility. His critics said he'd taken his philosophy to its final dreadful conclusion. Whatever the truth, the legacy of Ravenswood is not in what was proven, but in what refused to be explained. County archives show fires, floods, and bureaucratic accidents that erased its files repeatedly, as though some persistent, unseen hand kept ensuring that too much clarity never survived. Locals still tell newcomers to avoid the ridge after dark. They say it isn't haunted, only listening. When the wind moves through the trees, it doesn't sound. It's like rustling leaves. It sounds like breath drawn in and held. Every few years, a student or researcher announces plans to reopen the case, to find the missing basement, or uncover Finch's records. None ever finish their work. Equipment fails, permits are withdrawn, and interest fades as quietly as it begins. It's as if the silence that once defined Ravenswood continues to enforce itself, a living barrier stronger than any law. And perhaps that's fitting. For an asylum built on the idea that silence could heal the human mind, it achieved its doctrine perfectly. The hill speaks no more. Those who have walked there describe the same final image: pale soil, a faint smell of disinfectant after rain, and a feeling that someone just stepped out of sight around the corner, though there are no corners left. When night settles, a dim light still flickers where the administrative hall once stood. Not bright enough to travel by, not wild enough to be fire, just steady, deliberate, patient. The people of Jackson County have stopped asking what it is. They only say that as long as the light moves, Ravenswood is not entirely gone. And so it waits, still, cold, untouched, its silence unbroken, its nightmare preserved not in sound or sight, but in the calm that no living thing can quite explain.